North Korea has carried out a key party meeting to overlook and discuss issues regarding diplomacy, economy, and defense. During the meeting, the regime described its failed satellite launch as a most serious failure. For more on this, we're joined by Professor Robert Kelly this morning. Welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Sure. The regime acknowledged the failed satellite launch as being its most serious failure in the first half of the year. Professor Kelly, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so I think the most curious thing about the discussion of the satellite has been that the North Koreans have admitted that it didn't work, that it failed, right? This is not sort of typical. The totalitarian regime, the North often sort of markets itself as sort of nearly perfect in what it manages to do. It almost never admits failure. That's part of its competition with South Korea, where South Korea has very obviously exceeded the North. And so its willingness to sort of say this and say it's serious and talk about this repeatedly, I think, is what has sort of caught people's attention. I think if I had to guess, I think there are really sort of two reasons for this. The first, it's very obvious that it failed, right? We know that the South Koreans have retrieved parts. We know that the rest of the world has sort of observed this, and this information might leak back into North Korea. We know that the information cordon around North Korea is not as tight as it once was. This was fairly spectacular. The South Koreans are, your images right there showing it. The South Koreans are pulling stuff out of the sea that have come from this. I think that's sort of the first reason. And I think the second reason is that is probably, again, we're sort of speculating here, is that the North Korean regime wants to make sure that its own internal scientific apparatus stays committed to constructing these things and building these things and keeps on trying and trying, right? And if the North Koreans' attitude towards failure is that scientists get, purged or they lose their privileges or whatever if these launches fail, right, then that means you can never admit failure, which means the scientists won't take the necessary chances and risks and stuff like that. In other words, for this program to succeed, the North Koreans have to be able to accept, the leadership has to be able to accept and admit failure, right, because you don't always work, right? I mean, nobody's space program is perfect. And so I think this is one of the reasons why the Kim Jong-un regime has been much better with these launches than the previous regime, Kim Jong-il, in part because the Kim Jong-un is a little bit more aware that these things aren't always going to go smoothly, and he's willing to admit that. And that should help, in the long term, that should help the program be more successful.
Right. The satellite launch does appear to be the regime's top priority now that it's mentioned in its key party meeting as well. And the North...
I think it's pretty clear that the North Koreans want to actually develop greater satellite intelligence over South Korea, right? I mean, North Korea increasingly is not a conventional threat to South Korea so much as it is a missile threat, right? The North Korean army is very large, but it's fairly out of date, right? There are a lot of sort of questions about the health of its soldiers or whether or not it has enough fuel for its vehicles. I would argue the real threat to South Korea is North Korean missiles, and that means better targeting, right? If the North Koreans are actually going to strike sites in South Korea, U.S. bases, South Korean cities, things like that, Route 1, then the North Koreans need better data, right? They need better sort of mapping of what South Korea has, right? And presumably this means getting into space. They've really emphasized this a lot.
Right. And the North is also pledging to put another satellite into orbit soon. Now, how soon do you think is possible? I mean, how likely is it that the North will attempt to do so without giving notice this time?
Yeah, well, they won't give notice, right? Or if they do, it'll be sort of a short time before, right? The North Koreans are sort of notorious for not actually telling us stuff and just sort of like launching these. You remember when one fell near the Philippines a few years back, right? The Filipinos were really sort of caught off guard about that. I was in the Philippines at the time, and there was quite a hubbub over that. I would imagine the North Koreans will probably do this in the next 6 months to a year. When the North Koreans say these kinds of things, there's usually some kind of follow-through, not immediate. But the North Koreans have been pretty consistent, right, on this kind of stuff. It's pretty clear that Kim Jong-un wants a missile program, and he wants a satellite program to complement it, to help with targeting, as we talked about. And so I would imagine that, this will happen in the next 6 months to a year.
All right, at least several months to prepare for another launch attempt. Now, the North also says it's achieved progress in development of weapons, including nuclear weapons and also missiles. What could it be referring to? I mean, could it be in relation to its Hwasong-18 ballistic missile and possibly its 7th nuclear test?
Yeah, so I think a 7th nuclear test is coming. Although, to be honest, at this point, it's kind of up in the air, right? I mean, the CIA and the NIS have been telling us all for a while, the analyst community, they've been telling us for a while, this thing was going to happen. Remember, it was supposed to happen last year before Christmas or something like that. But, if the North Koreans are going to have a nuclear missile program, right, they're going to have a nuclear program, they have to test, right? And the North Koreans obviously want larger warheads. The bigger the warheads are, the more damage they do, the more they can threaten the United States directly, which is key to prevent North Korea, to keep the United States out of a South Korean conflict or a Korean conflict. That's what the North Koreans want, right? To deter the U.S. from entering a Korean conflict by threatening massive retaliation on the U.S. homeland. So they need to build bigger weapons, and these things have to be tested. So I would imagine that will happen. Same thing with the missile tests, right? Again, I would argue that the primary threat that North Korea now faces, presents to South Korea is primarily through missiles, right? The traditional conventional North Korean military is pretty out of date. So I would argue that the missiles are the real issue, and so they're going to keep on testing and testing and testing because this is what they're going to do, right? If there's another conflict between the two Koreas, right, the North Koreans are going to strike South Korea all over the country. Military sites, the Busan port where I am, Route 1, all these things are going to be hit by missiles probably pretty early in the conflict. And so, I mean, this is the North Koreans' big competitive advantage against you, the South Koreans, at this point.
That's a very good point, Professor. Now, the North has registered to compete in the Asian Games that's scheduled for this fall in China. Does it mean we'll see the North resume participation in other international events?
Yeah, that's a good question. The North Koreans are really all over the place on this kind of stuff, right? We invite them. They get invited a lot to these sorts of things, to different events and things like that. And sometimes they come and sometimes they don't. I think it would be a great idea if they did, right? People-to-people diplomacy is one area where maybe we can make a little bit of progress with North Korea at the diplomatic level. Obviously, it's pretty difficult, right? But I mean, actually trying to sort of like talk to regular North Koreans, trying to sort of have students, for example, who go to European universities or sort of go to China or something like that, and they get to see a little bit more of how modern societies function. These things are valuable. Having North Korean athletes go to events and sort of see that the rest of the world operates, in a way much less hostile than the way North Korean propaganda presents it. All these things I think are valuable, right? It'd particularly be a good idea if South Korean and North Korean athletes can interact at these kinds of things. But it's just not clear to me that the North Koreans have made any kind of a big shift on this. As far as I know, there's been no major pronouncement from Kim or the people around him that there's some big policy shift here. It seems like the North Koreans just sort of decide on a case-by-case basis.
Right, then does that mean the North's participation in the Asian Games mean that they're over or done with the pandemic because the rest of the world has entered the endemic phase, right?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, too. My sense is that the North Koreans never really took the pandemic that seriously, right? I mean, the regime has a sort of a pretty harsh history, right, regarding its concern for its own people and when they're suffering, right? I mean, it famously allowed several million people to starve to death in the late 1990s. And, we know that malnutrition because of state policy has been an issue in North Korea for decades, right? So it's actually, I wouldn't surprise me at all if the North Korean attitude towards COVID is that, well, that's something that didn't really happen to us, and it was just a fever, and that was something that happened in Western decadent societies, and we're moving right along, right? So yes, I would argue that this is probably an example of the North Koreans, just sort of moving away from COVID, and it never really happened, and it's just sort of a part of the past, and whatever. It was this brief sort of weird interlude, it was this interregnum, and now it's over and we're back to normality. Yeah, that fits very much with the way North Korea, addressed COVID, which is in some way to basically ignore it.
Right. Still, it'll be cool and refreshing to see North Korean players back on the games on international level.
It would help a great deal, yes.
All right, Professor Kelly, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for your time. Thanks for having me.